The dust-swept town of Broken Spoke hadn't seen blood spilled in nearly 2 years. That was about to change when 4 shadows darkened the saloon doors one scorching afternoon in August 1875. Nobody knew then that they'd chosen the wrong man to mock. A man whose lightning-fast draw had sent 37 souls to their maker, though you'd never guess it from his worn boots and quiet demeanor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The merciless Texas sun beat down on Jedediah McCullough's weathered hat as he guided his dappled mare down the main street of Broken Spoke. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's despite the trail dust, took in every detail of the sleepy town, the general store with its fresh coat of whitewash, the blacksmith's forge silent in the afternoon heat, and May Wilson's saloon, where a cluster of horses stood hitched outside. The smell of fresh-baked bread wafted from the baker's shop, mixing with the ever-present dust and leather that marked every town west of the Mississippi. Jedediah hadn't planned to stop in Broken Spoke. His destination lay another 100 miles west, where a man could still disappear into vast stretches of untamed country. But his mare needed rest, and truth be told, so did he. 6 days of hard riding had left both horse and rider bone-weary, and the dark clouds gathering on the horizon promised the kind of storm that only a fool would ride through. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, though few would have noticed the subtle way he favored his right leg, an old reminder from his cavalry days that ached when rain was coming. The wooden sidewalk creaked under his boots as he approached the saloon's entrance, the twin colts at his hips concealed beneath his long duster. A tumbleweed skittered past, driven by the hot wind that whispered of coming rain. Inside May Wilson's establishment, the usual afternoon quiet had been shattered by the raucous laughter of 4 men clustered around a corner table. Their clothes were trail-worn, but their guns were polished, and the way they carried themselves spoke of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. The room smelled of stale beer, tobacco smoke, and the kind of trouble that followed certain men like a shadow. Hank Sidewinder Denton, their leader, was in the middle of a story that had his companions howling. And then the yellow-bellied banker starts crying, "Please, sir, don't shoot," like I was some kind of gentleman. He slapped the table, making the bottles dance. His voice carried the rough edge of a man who'd spent too many years drinking bad whiskey and breathing trail dust. Jedediah paid them no mind as he made his way to the bar, where May Wilson stood polishing glasses with a cloth that had seen better days. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, with steel-gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that had seen every type of trouble a saloon could offer. A small scar near her left temple suggested she'd learned to handle that trouble on her own terms. "Whiskey," Jedediah said quietly, placing a coin on the worn wood. "And information, if you're selling that too." His voice was soft but carried the weight of authority, the kind earned through years of having your words backed by steel. May's eyes flickered to the rowdy group in the corner before returning to Jedediah. A shadow of concern crossed her face, quick as lightning but just as telling. "Whiskey's cheaper," she said, reaching for a bottle. "Information might cost you more than you're willing to pay." Her hands moved with the deliberate care of someone used to handling both liquor and loaded conversations. The liquid she poured was amber and clean, better than the usual rot gut found in trail town saloons. Jedediah noticed that too, filing it away with all the other small details that seemed odd about Broken Spoke. The town was too prosperous, too clean for its location. Something wasn't adding up. "Passing through?" May asked, though it wasn't really a question. Most were these days. The railroad was coming, and with it the kind of changes that made some men rich and others desperate. Jedediah nodded, raising the glass to his lips. The whiskey was smooth, confirming his suspicions about the town's unusual prosperity. A place this far from anywhere had no business serving liquor this fine unless... His thoughts were interrupted by a crash from the corner. Billy Tucker, the youngest of Denton's gang, had knocked over his chair, standing up too quickly. His face was flushed with drink and bravado, his gun belt tied low in the way of men looking to prove themselves. "Hey, old-timer!" Billy called out, staggering slightly. Ain't polite to ignore your fellow patrons." His words slurred together, but the challenge in them was clear as day. Jedediah set his glass down slowly, but didn't turn around. May Wilson's hand disappeared beneath the bar, where Jedediah assumed she kept a scattergun for trouble. The other patrons in the saloon began to quietly move away from what was beginning to feel like a powder keg about to blow. "Now, Billy," Jed Rollins drawled, "leave the man to his drink. Can't you see he's trying to fade into the woodwork?" This brought another round of laughter from the gang, though Luke Deadeye Walker's laugh didn't reach his eyes. "Nah, that ain't right," Billy continued, emboldened by his companion's amusement. "A man ought to be sociable, especially in a fine establishment like this." He swaggered toward the bar, spurs jingling with each exaggerated step, his shadow stretching long across the sawdust-covered floor. Luke Deadeye Walker watched the scene unfold with calculating eyes, his hand resting casually near his holster. Unlike his younger companion, he'd noticed something about the quiet stranger. The way he'd entered the saloon, the practiced sweep of his eyes, the perfect stillness with which he held himself now. It was the stillness of a coiled rattler, waiting for the precise moment to strike. "I mean no trouble," Jedediah said quietly, still facing the bar. His voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room. It was the kind of voice that made smart men pause and think carefully about their next move. Billy Tucker wasn't a smart man. "Well, trouble's what you got, old man." He reached for Jedediah's shoulder. "When I'm talking to you, you turn around and—" What happened next was so quick that later, witnesses would disagree on the exact sequence of events. Billy's hand never reached Jedediah's shoulder. In one fluid motion, the quiet stranger spun, his duster falling open. His right hand moved like lightning, and suddenly Billy was staring down the barrel of a Colt revolver that seemed to have materialized from thin air. "Son," Jedediah said, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, "I'm going to give you some free advice. It's the kind that's kept me breathing a lot longer than most men expected. Never touch a stranger in a saloon, especially one who doesn't want to be touched." The color drained from Billy's face as he finally noticed what Luke Walker had seen earlier. The way this man's eyes held the cold, steady gaze of someone who had dealt death more times than he cared to count. In that moment, the only sound in the saloon was the distant rumble of thunder, promising a storm that would change everything in Broken Spoke. The tension in May Wilson's saloon could have been cut with a knife. Billy Tucker stood frozen, his young face caught between fear and wounded pride as he stared down the barrel of Jedediah's Colt. Adam's apple bobbed nervously above his dusty bandana, and a bead of sweat traced its way down his temple, leaving a clean line through the trail dust on his face. Behind him, his companions had gone quiet, but their hands had drifted closer to their weapons. The afternoon sun slanting through the windows cast long shadows across the sawdust-covered floor, like prison bars holding them all in place. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, its creaking rhythm matching the thundering pulse in Billy's ears. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat forgotten on the bar, the amber liquid catching the dying sunlight filtering through the dusty windows. Outside, storm clouds gathered ominously, turning the sky the color of a week-old bruise. Hank Sidewinder Denton pushed his chair back slowly, the scraping sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight as he rose to his full height, a man accustomed to towering over others. "Now, friend," he said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a winter sun, "it seems to me you're overreacting to a mite. The boy meant no harm." But his eyes told a different story, the story of a man unused to being challenged, especially in front of his men. His silver spurs caught the light as he took a measured step forward, each jingle a warning bell in the tense atmosphere. May Wilson's hand remained beneath the bar, and her knuckles had gone white against the polished wood. She'd seen her share of trouble in 20 years of running the saloon, but something about this felt different. The few other patrons in the saloon had pressed themselves against the walls, leaving a clear space around the unfolding drama. They'd seen enough trouble in their lives to recognize the smell of death in the air. Old Tom Jenkins, the local farrier, was already inching his way toward the back door, his half-eaten meal abandoned on his table. Meant no harm? Jedediah's voice remained quiet, but there was something in it now that made the hair on the back of necks stand up. His words carried the weight of countless confrontations, each one etched into the lines around his eyes and the scars hidden beneath his duster. A man's intentions don't matter much when he's fool enough to reach for a stranger. Dead is dead, whether you meant it or not. His gun hadn't moved a fraction of an inch, steady as a stone. The worn pearl grip seemed to glow with an inner light, a stark contrast to the blued steel of the barrel. Luke Deadeye Walker shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, trying to get a better angle. His reputation with a gun wasn't just barroom talk. He'd killed 7 men in fair fights, and considerably more in unfair ones. But Jedediah's peripheral vision caught the movement, and without taking his eyes off Billy, he said, "I wouldn't if I were you. Some days, a man's trigger finger gets mighty itchy when folks start dancing around behind him." The warning in his voice was clear as a rattler's buzz. Jed Rollins, who'd been quietly moving toward the end of the bar, froze in his tracks. The way this stranger had spotted Walker's movement without looking told him everything he needed to know about the kind of man they were dealing with. Rollins had served in the war, and he recognized the situational awareness that only came from years of watching for ambushes and checking corners for hidden enemies. "Listen here," Denton tried again, his false warmth beginning to crack like sun-baked mud. "We're all friends in here. How about we buy you a drink and we can forget this whole misunderstanding?" But his right hand had settled on his gun belt, fingers twitching near the hammer of his Remington. The nickel-plated weapon had claimed more than its share of lives, most of them men who'd been offered similar false friendships. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A flash of lightning illuminated the saloon through the windows, followed by a low growl of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The storm was getting closer, mirroring the tension building inside. Miss Betty Lou Parker, who'd been watching from the doorway of the general store across the street, ducked back inside to tell the others what was unfolding at May's place. Within minutes, word would spread through the small town like wildfire. "The only misunderstanding," Jedediah replied, "is you thinking I'm the kind of man who can be bought with a drink." He finally turned his head slightly, keeping Billy in his peripheral vision while fixing Denton with a stare that had made braver men step back. Years of hard living had etched deep lines around his eyes, but those eyes themselves were clear and sharp as broken glass. "I've known your kind before. You ride into quiet towns thinking your guns make you giants among men. But I've buried giants before, and the worms don't seem to care how tall they stood." Billy's hand twitched toward his gun, and Jedediah's trigger finger tightened ever so slightly. The young man's holster was tied down low, gunfighter style, but the wear patterns on the leather told a story of more practice than actual experience. "Son," Jedediah said, "that would be your last mistake. You're fast, I'll grant you that, but I've been killing men since before you were weaned, and I ain't yet met the one who could beat me to the draw." "You're mighty confident for an old man," Denton sneered, his facade of friendliness completely gone now. A vein pulsed in his temple, and his voice carried the edge of a man unused to being defied. 4 against 1 ain't good odds, no matter how quick you think you are." His gang spread out slightly, each man finding their preferred position for what seemed increasingly inevitable. The ghost of a smile touched Jedediah's lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes had seen too much death to find any real humor in its approach. 4 against 1? He gave a small, dry chuckle that sent chills down spines. "Boy, I've killed more men before breakfast than you've got standing here. But if you're determined to find out just how fast I am, well..." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The silence stretched like a bowstring pulled taut. "I suppose the Undertaker could use the business." Another crack of thunder shook the windows, closer now. A few drops of rain began to patter against the roof, a gentle counterpoint to the deadly symphony playing out below. The smell of ozone and gunmetal filled the air, mixing with the familiar scents of whiskey and tobacco that permeated the saloon's wooden walls. "Now," Jedediah continued, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel, "here's what's going to happen. Young Billy here is going to back away nice and slow. Then you boys are going to gather your things and ride out of Broken Spoke. The weather's turning sour, but I reckon it's better to ride in the rain than be planted in the mud." His words hung in the air like smoke, each one carefully chosen and delivered with the precision of a surgeon's knife. Denton's face darkened with rage, the color rising from his neck to his weathered cheeks. His hand tightened on his gun belt until the leather creaked. "You don't give orders to me, old man. This here's our town now, and—" "Your town?" Jedediah's interruption was sharp as a razor. The words cut through the air like a whip crack. "Strange. I just had a word with May here about that very thing. Seems to me a town this prosperous, this far from anywhere, might have some interesting stories to tell. Stories about missing bank shipments, perhaps, or why did the stage line change its route last month?" The color drained from Denton's face, and Luke Walker's calculating eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. They'd been careful, or so they'd thought. But something in the stranger's tone suggested he knew more than he should. The rain began to fall harder outside, drumming against the roof like distant hoofbeats, nature's own deadline for the drama unfolding beneath it. A heavy silence fell over the saloon as Jedediah's words about the missing bank shipments hung in the air. The rain outside had picked up its tempo, drumming against the roof like nervous fingers on a trigger. Through the water-streaked windows, the last rays of sunlight painted the room in shades of amber and blood. May Wilson's hand tightened on whatever lay beneath the bar, her weathered face a mask of carefully controlled fear. She'd suspected something wasn't right about Denton's gang when they'd first ridden into town 3 weeks ago, but suspicion was a far cry from certainty. The way they'd slowly taken control of Broken Spoke had been subtle at first. A few quiet conversations with the right people, some well-placed threats, and suddenly the town marshal had taken an extended leave of absence. "You talk too much, old man," Denton growled, his affected charm completely stripped away now. His hand hadn't moved from his gun, but his fingers had stopped their nervous dance. There was something more dangerous in their stillness. "Ain't healthy to spread rumors about folks you don't know?" Jedediah's smile grew a fraction wider, but his eyes remained cold as desert nights. "Rumors?" He shifted his weight slightly, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. "Funny thing about rumors, they tend to follow certain paths. Like how the Wells Fargo stage changed its route right after you boys showed up, or how 3 bank shipments have gone missing between here and Fort Worth, all within a day's ride of Broken Spoke." Luke Walker's face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. His reputation as a gunfighter was well earned, but there was more to it than just speed. He was the planner, the one who worked out the timing of their robberies down to the minute. And now, this stranger was laying out their operations like he was reading from a ledger. "You seem awfully well informed for a man just passing through," Jed Rollins said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a rattler about to strike. He'd managed to edge another foot closer to the end of the bar, but Jedediah's gun hadn't wavered from Billy's chest. A flash of lightning illuminated the saloon, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that rattled the bottles behind the bar. In that brief, brilliant moment, Miss Betty Lou Parker, still watching from the shelter of the general store's awning, saw several townspeople gathering at the edges of the street, drawn by the tension emanating from May's place. "Information's a funny thing," Jedediah replied, his voice barely audible above the storm. "It travels faster than men, if you know where to listen. Like in Fort Smith, where I heard about a gang working their way through Texas. 4 men, led by someone calling himself Sidewinder, always hitting places just off the main routes, always a step ahead of the law." Billy Tucker's young face had gone from fear to confusion. He'd joined up with Denton's gang 6 months ago, drawn by the promise of easy money and adventure. But there were things about their operations he'd never been told, pieces of the puzzle that hadn't quite fit together until now. "Marshal Crawford in Fort Smith sends his regards, by the way." Jedediah continued, watching the color drain from Denton's face. He was mighty interested in the description I gave him of the men who robbed that Army payroll last month. Seemed to think it matched a certain group he'd been tracking since the Oklahoma Territory. Denton's composure cracked like thin ice. "You're a lawman," he spat, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. His hand tightened on his gun, knuckles white against the worn leather of his holster. Jedediah corrected him softly. Was a lawman. Texas Rangers before the war. These days I just try to mind my own business. His eyes flickered briefly to Make, then back to Denton. But some things a man can't ignore, like when he rides into a town and finds wolves among the sheep. The rain hammered harder against the roof, and a gust of wind rattled the saloon's swinging doors. Doc Henry, Old Bones Sanders, had joined the growing crowd outside, his medical bag in hand. In 20 years of practicing medicine in frontier towns, he'd learned to read the signs of impending violence, as well as any tracker read trail signs. "You made a mistake coming in here alone," Luke Walker said, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man who'd calculated the odds and found them in his favor. "Even if you're as fast as you claim, you can't watch all of us at once." A low chuckle escaped Jedediah's throat, but there was no humor in it. "Who says I came alone?" His words caused a subtle shift in the room, as 4 pairs of eyes darted briefly toward the windows. "You boys might want to take a look outside. Seems the good people of Broken Spoke have had enough of your hospitality." Through the rain-streaked glass, the gathering crowd was visible now. Sheriff Clayton Hawkins had appeared from somewhere, his badge catching what little light remained. Beside him stood Jasper Grizzly Miller, the old stablemaster's shotgun held casually but purposefully in his gnarled hands. "This changes nothing," Denton snarled, but there was a new edge of desperation in his voice. "By the time they get in here, you'll be dead," Jedediah finished for him, his tone matter-of-fact. "All 4 of you. Maybe you'll take me with you, maybe not. But ask yourself this. Is whatever you've got stored away worth dying for?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Billy Tucker's hand had begun to shake slightly, his youth and inexperience showing through the cracks in his gunfighter facade. Even Luke Walker's calculating expression had taken on a hint of uncertainty as he reassessed their situation. "Last chance," Jedediah said, his voice cutting through the sound of rain and thunder. "Walk away. Leave Broken Spoke to its rightful owners. Or don't." The threat in those last 2 words was as clear as the Colt in his hand. Outside, the storm reached its peak, nature's own backdrop to the drama unfolding within the saloon's walls. The moment stretched like a taut wire, ready to either snap or hold, with 4 lives hanging in the balance. The rain pounding against the roof of May Wilson's saloon seemed to match the heartbeats of every man inside. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief, stark moment, Hank Sidewinder Denton's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, rage warring with fear, pride grappling with survival instinct. His life of violence had taught him to read situations, to know when to push and when to fold, but he'd never backed down in front of his men before. "Time's running out," Jedediah said, his voice carrying over the storm's fury. The Colt in his hand remained steady, its worn pearl grip reflecting the dim lamplight. "I can see you thinking it through, Denton. Wondering if you're really as fast as you think you are. Wondering if your boys here will back your play or if they've got more sense than loyalty." Luke Walker's eyes narrowed at those words. He'd ridden with Denton for 3 years, pulled off 24 robberies without a single mistake. But there was something about this stranger that made his scalp prickle, the way he held himself, the cold certainty in his voice. Walker had killed his share of men, but this Jedediah, he carried death around him like a well-worn coat. Billy Tucker's young face was a study in confusion and fear. The glamour of the outlaw life that had drawn him in 6 months ago was crumbling like sand between his fingers. His gun hand trembled slightly, and sweat trickled down his temple despite the relative cool of the rain-swept afternoon. "You said you were a ranger," Jed Rollins spoke up, his voice carefully neutral. He'd served in the war, had seen enough killing to last several lifetimes. "What made you quit?" A shadow passed across Jedediah's weathered features. Same thing that makes most men quit. Saw too much, did too much. War has a way of changing a man's perspective on justice. His eyes never left Denton as he spoke. But some habits don't die, like knowing when a town's being bled dry by men who think their guns make them kings. May Wilson's hand had never left whatever lay beneath her bar, but her eyes were fixed on the scene before her. 20 years of running a saloon had taught her to read men like books, and everything about this situation screamed of impending violence. The few remaining patrons had pressed themselves flat against the walls, trying to become one with the woodwork. Outside, the crowd had grown larger despite the rain. Sheriff Clayton Hawkins had positioned himself near the saloon's front door, his deputies spreading out to cover the other exits. The town had endured 3 weeks of Denton's subtle tyranny, and the powder keg of resentment needed only a spark to ignite. "Might be we could come to an arrangement," Denton said finally, his voice struggling for its earlier smoothness and failing. "Way I see it, there's enough wealth in these parts for everyone to get their share. Man with your experience could be valuable to our operation." The ghost of a smile touched Jedediah's lips, but his eyes remained cold as mountain lakes. "Now, see? That's the kind of thinking that separates men like you from men like me. You look at a town and see something to take. I look at it and see something worth protecting." Another crack of thunder rattled the windows, and Billy Tucker jumped slightly, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. The sound drew Jedediah's attention for a fraction of a second, not enough to be called a distraction, but enough for Luke Walker to see an opportunity. His hand moved like lightning toward his holster. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for those watching. Without taking his gun off Billy, Jedediah's left hand whipped out his second Colt from beneath his duster. The movement was so fluid, so practiced, it looked more like a conjurer's trick than a gunfighter's draw. Walker's gun had barely cleared leather when Jedediah's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the floor. The report of the shot was deafening in the confined space, mixing with the thunder outside until they were indistinguishable. "That was your demonstration," Jedediah said calmly, now holding 2 guns, one still trained on Billy, the other covering Denton and Rollins. "Next one goes someplace more permanent." Walker clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. He'd prided himself on his speed, built his reputation on it, but this stranger had drawn and fired before he'd even gotten his gun up. "Luke!" Billy started to move toward his fallen companion, but Jedediah's voice stopped him cold. "Stay right where you are, son. Your friend there will live, provided he gets to Doc Sanders in time. But that depends entirely on what happens in the next few minutes." Rain continued to drum against the roof, and somewhere in the distance, lightning split the sky again. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the ozone from the storm, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and possibilities. Denton's face had gone the color of old parchment. The lightning-fast display of gunplay had shattered his remaining bravado like a mirror hitting stone. His eyes darted between his wounded friend, his terrified young protege, and the inexorable stranger, who held their lives in his steady hands. "Last chance," Jedediah said softly, but his voice carried to every corner of the suddenly silent saloon. "Walk away. Leave your guns, take your horses, and ride. The law will catch up to you eventually, but that's tomorrow's problem. Right now, you just have to decide if you want to see another sunrise." The moment stretched like taffy, thick with possibilities and pregnant with violence. Outside, the townsfolk waited in the rain, their patience wearing as thin as the last rays of daylight filtering through the storm clouds. Inside, 4 men stood at a crossroads, their fate balanced on the edge of a decision. Time seemed to freeze in May Wilson's saloon as Hank Sidewinder Denton stood at the crossroads of his life. The blood from Luke Walker's shoulder wound had begun to pool on the rough wooden floor, mixing with puddles of rainwater tracked in from outside. The wounded man's labored breathing punctuated the tension like a broken clock, marking seconds that stretched into eternity. May Wilson had seen her share of standoffs in 20 years behind the bar, but something about this one felt different. The air itself seemed charged with more than just the lightning outside. It crackled with the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. Her hand remained steady on the scattergun beneath the bar, though she knew in her heart it wouldn't be needed. One way or another, this would end with Jedediah's guns. "You're bleeding out, Luke," Jedediah said quietly, his dual Colts unwavering. "Doc Sanders is right outside. Probably already has his instruments laid out. He's got quite a reputation in these parts. Saved 3 men in the Mason County War who everyone said were goners." His eyes flickered briefly to the wounded man before returning to Denton. "But he can't help if you're dead." Billy Tucker's young face had gone pale as milk, his earlier bravado washed away like trail dust in the rain. He joined Denton's gang dreaming of adventure and glory, seduced by campfire tales of daring robberies and dramatic escapes. Now, watching Luke Walker's life seep into the floorboards, those dreams tasted like ashes in his mouth. "Shut up," Denton snarled, but his voice lacked its usual authority. The careful plans he'd laid for Broken Spoke were unraveling faster than a cheap saddle blanket. 3 weeks of methodically taking control of the town, of identifying the weak points in the bank shipment routes, all undone by one quiet stranger with eyes like winter frost. A particularly loud crack of thunder made the windows rattle, and in that moment, Jed Rollins made his move. His hand dropped to his gun with the speed of a striking rattler, but Jedediah had been watching for just such an attempt. The former Ranger's left-hand Colt barked once, and Rollins's gun went spinning from his grip, along with 2 of his fingers. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph!" Rollins clutched his bleeding hand to his chest, his face gone gray with shock and pain. The severed fingers lay in the sawdust like discarded cigarette butts, a sight that had Billy Tucker retching in the corner. "That's 2 demonstrations," Jedediah said, his voice still carrying that terrible calm. "I really don't want to give a third. The undertaker in this town charges too much according to May here." Outside, the crowd had grown larger despite the deteriorating weather. Sheriff Clayton Hawkins had positioned men at every possible escape route, though from the way things were going, escape seemed less and less likely. Through the rain-streaked windows, faces could be seen pressing against the glass, watching the drama unfold like a theater show. "You don't understand," Denton said, and for the first time, there was something close to desperation in his voice. "We've got partners in this operation, important people, the kind who don't take kindly to their plans being disrupted." Jedediah's weathered face showed no reaction, but his eyes hardened slightly. "You mean Judge Morrison over in Fort Worth? Maybe State Representative Buchanan?" He allowed himself a small smile as Denton's jaw dropped. "Did you really think you were the first gang to try setting up operations with political protection? I've been hunting men like you since before the war, Denton. The corrupt officials always follow the same pattern." Luke Walker had managed to prop himself up against the bar, his good hand pressed against his wounded shoulder. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a pain that made his vision blur at the edges. But even through the haze of agony, he could see what Jedediah's words were doing to his boss. Denton's carefully constructed world was crumbling, and like all falling things, it would either crash or explode. "Those men." Denton's voice shook with equal parts fear and rage. "They'll hunt you down, they'll burn this town to the ground. You think you're doing these people a favor? You're signing their death warrants." A flash of lightning illuminated the saloon, casting harsh shadows across Jedediah's face. "You know what I think? I think you're stalling, hoping I'll get distracted, lose focus, give you the opening you need." His voice took on an edge of steel. "But while we've been having this conversation, federal marshals have been closing in on Judge Morrison's ranch. Probably there by now, actually. And Representative Buchanan?" He allowed himself another small smile. "Let's just say his secretary was very helpful once the Pinkertons explained his situation." The color drained from Denton's face as the full implications of Jedediah's words sank in. This wasn't just some chance encounter with a former lawman. This was the culmination of a much larger operation, and they'd walked right into it. "No," Denton whispered, his hand inching toward his gun. "No, you're lying, trying to rattle us. Nobody could have—" "6 months of investigation," Jedediah cut him off. "Following the money, connecting the dots. Your gang was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Though I'll admit, you stumbling into my path today saved us some time tracking you down." The rain continued its relentless drumming on the roof, but now it sounded less like nature's music and more like the nails being driven into Denton's coffin. Behind him, Billy Tucker had backed himself into a corner, his young face a mask of confusion and betrayal as he realized just how deep the rabbit hole went. "So, here's your real choice," Jedediah continued, his guns remaining steady as stones. "You can surrender now, testify against your partners, maybe see daylight again before your hair turns gray. Or you can try your luck with those guns, and I'll send you to meet the devil with express delivery." The moment hung in the air like smoke, heavy with the weight of decisions and consequences. Outside, the storm reached a fever pitch as if nature itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. For the briefest moment, something close to sanity flickered in Hank Sidewinder Denton's eyes. The odds were clear as desert sky. 2 wounded men, 1 terrified boy, and himself against a man who'd just proven he could shoot the fingers off a gunslinger without breaking a sweat. But sanity had never been Denton's strong suit, and pride had killed more men than bullets ever would. "You know what I think?" Denton's voice had taken on the peculiar calm of a man who'd made peace with his own death. "I think you talk too much for a man holding 2 guns." His hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching like a rattler's tail. "Real killers. They don't waste breath on speeches." Mae Wilson recognized the look in Denton's eyes. She'd seen it before in the war, men who'd decided that dying in flames was better than living with shame. Her fingers tightened on the scattergun's stock as she watched 20 years of saloon-keeping experience tell her what was coming next. "That's your takeaway from all this?" Jedediah asked, genuine curiosity coloring his tone. "That I'm not a real killer because I gave you a chance to walk away?" A sad smile touched his lips, but didn't reach his eyes. "Son, a real killer knows exactly what death costs. That's why some of us try to avoid charging that price when we can." The rain hammered against the roof with increasing fury, and the wind had begun to howl through the gaps in the saloon's weather-worn walls. It was as if nature itself was building toward something inevitable, something that would wash Broken Spoke clean of the blood about to be spilled. Luke Walker, still propped against the bar with his wounded shoulder, saw it coming first. Maybe it was because he'd ridden with Denton longest, or maybe it was just the peculiar clarity that sometimes comes with pain, but he recognized the subtle shift in his boss's stance. "Hank, don't," he started to say, but it was too late. Denton's draw was a thing of beauty, the kind of speed that had built his reputation and filled graveyards across 3 territories. The Remington seemed to materialize in his hand like magic, its nickel plating catching the lamplight as it swung toward Jedediah's chest. But Jedediah hadn't been exaggerating about his own abilities. Before Denton's gun had cleared leather, both Colts roared in perfect synchronization. The first shot took Denton in the gun hand, shattering bones and sending Remington spinning away like a drunken butterfly. The second caught him high on the right shoulder, the impact spinning him halfway around. Billy Tucker, driven by either loyalty or panic, went for his gun next. His draw was actually faster than Denton's had been, but youth and speed were no match for experience and anticipation. Jedediah's left-hand Colt barked once more, and Billy's gun hand exploded in a spray of red. The young outlaw screamed, more in surprise than pain, and collapsed to his knees. "Nobody moves." Jedediah's voice cracked like a whip through the gunsmoke. "Next shot goes somewhere vital." The sound of gunfire had drawn the crowd outside even closer to the saloon. Through the rain-streaked windows, faces pressed against the glass, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and fascination. Sheriff Clayton Hawkins had his gun drawn now, ready to burst in at the first sign that Jedediah might need help. Denton lay on the floor, clutching his ruined hand, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. "How?" he managed to gasp. "Nobody's that fast? Nobody?" "I tried to tell you," Jedediah said quietly, the guns in his hands still rock-steady. "I've been doing this a long time, longer than you've been alive, probably." He shifted his stance slightly, keeping all 4 men covered. "The speed's not even the important part. It's knowing when the shot's coming, reading it in a man's eyes before his brain even tells his hand to move. May Wilson had finally removed her hand from beneath the bar, revealing not a scattergun, but an ancient Colt dragoon that looked like it had seen service in the Mexican War. "Town's been in need of cleaning for a while now," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. "Reckon you just saved us all a lot of trouble." Through the windows, they could see Doc Sanders already pushing his way through the crowd, his medical bag clutched tight against his chest to protect it from the rain. The old physician had seen enough gunfight aftermath to know his services would be needed, regardless of how this played out. "Please," Billy Tucker whimpered from his place on the floor, cradling his wounded hand. "I didn't know about any of it. The judge, the representative. I just wanted to be somebody." Blood seeped between his fingers, mixing with tears on the sawdust-covered floor. "Everybody wants to be somebody, kid," Jedediah replied, a touch of compassion entering his voice. "But this ain't the way to do it. Never was." He raised his voice slightly, pitching it to carry outside. "Sheriff Hawkins, might want to come collect these fellows before they bleed all over May's floor. And send Doc Sanders in. Got some patching up that needs doing." The saloon doors swung open, admitting a gust of wind and rain, along with the sheriff and his deputies. The crowd outside pressed closer, eager to see the aftermath of what would surely become part of Broken Spoke's legend. As Hawkins and his men began securing the wounded outlaws, Jedediah finally lowered his guns, though he didn't holster them just yet. 20 years of experience had taught him that the most dangerous moment often came after you thought the fight was over. "You really came here hunting them?" May asked, her own ancient revolver finally disappearing beneath the bar again. "Or was this just luck?" "Bit of both," Jedediah admitted, watching as Doc Sanders began examining Luke Walker's shoulder wound. "Had word they were operating in the area, but didn't expect to find them so quickly." He paused, then added quietly, "Sometimes luck is just God's way of remaining anonymous." The storm outside had begun to ease, as if nature herself had decided the drama in May Wilson's saloon had reached a satisfactory conclusion. The rain softened to a gentle patter against the roof, and the thunder grew distant, like the memory of gunfire fading into legend. Inside, the sharp smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood, and the ever-present odors of whiskey and leather. Doc Sanders worked with practiced efficiency, his weathered hands moving from one wounded man to another. Luke Walker's shoulder wound had been cleaned and bandaged, while Jed Rollins sat in shocked silence staring at the space where two of his fingers used to be. Billy Tucker's injured hand had been wrapped in clean white bandages, already showing spots of red. The young outlaw hadn't stopped crying, though his tears had turned from pain to something deeper, the realization that his life would never be the same. Hank Sidewinder Denton sat propped against the bar, his own wounds tended, but his pride bleeding worse than any bullet hole. His eyes never left Jedediah, who had finally holstered one of his Colts but kept the other loose in his hand, more from habit than necessity. "Sheriff," Jedediah called out, his voice carrying easily across the now-crowded saloon. "You might want to send someone out to their camp. Should be up in the hills north of town, probably near Parker's Creek. Likely to find some interesting documentation there. Letters, ledgers, that sort of thing." Sheriff Clayton Hawkins nodded, dispatching 2 deputies with a gesture. The lawman had been in Broken Spoke for 15 years, and this was the first time he'd felt truly useful in months. Denton's gang had played their takeover so smoothly that by the time he'd realized what was happening, it had been too late to do anything about it. "They won't find anything," Denton growled, though his voice lacked its former authority. "We weren't fool enough to keep paper trails." A thin smile crossed Jedediah's face. "No. Then I suppose that strongbox under your bed, the one with Judge Morrison's letterhead all over its contents, just happened to appear there by magic." He watched with satisfaction as what little color remained drained from Denton's face. "Like I said, I've been tracking you boys for a while now." May Wilson moved behind her bar with deliberate calm. though her hands shook slightly as she poured a measure of her good whiskey and set it in front of Jedediah. "On the house," she said quietly. "Reckon you saved this town a world of hurt." The crowd that had gathered outside was now filtering into the saloon, their faces a mixture of relief, curiosity, and the slightly disappointed look of those who had missed the main excitement. Miss Betty Lou Parker made her way to the bar, her normally pristine shop dress damp from the rain, and began helping May clean up the broken glass and spilled liquor. "Ain't just the town you saved." Jasper Grizzly Miller spoke up from his position near the door, his shotgun still cradled in his gnarled hands. Way they were going, it wouldn't have been long before they started demanding protection money from every business in Broken Spoke. Already started hinting at it to some folks. Jedediah nodded, but didn't touch the whiskey. His eyes constantly scanned the room, old habits dying hard. They always follow the same pattern. Start small, work their way up. By the time folks realize what's happening, it's usually too late. He paused, then added, "But it's never too late to fight back." Doc Sanders straightened up from where he'd been examining Denton's wounds, wiping his hands on a now bloody cloth. "They'll live," he announced to no one in particular, "though these two might have some trouble handling guns in the future." He nodded toward Rollins and Billy Tucker. "Mighty precise shooting, if you don't mind my saying so." "Had a lot of practice," Jedediah replied simply. "Found out early on that killing men wasn't always the answer. Sometimes just taking away their ability to cause trouble works better." The rain outside had almost stopped now, and through the windows, they could see the sun trying to break into Rao. Tayaks, and a shaft of late afternoon light slanted through the saloon's front windows, catching the dust and gun smoke still hanging in the air, making it dance like golden snow. Sheriff Hawkins approached Jedediah, his manner respectful but official. "Got a telegraph from Fort Worth earlier today. Seems you weren't exaggerating about those federal marshals. They hit Judge Morrison's ranch this morning and found enough evidence to put him away for 20 years. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "They mentioned a special investigator would be passing through, someone who'd been working on this case for months. That would be you, I take it." Before Jedediah could answer, a commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. Two riders had pulled up outside, their horses lathered with sweat despite the cool rain. Through the windows, they could see the distinctive badges of U.S. Marshals glinting on their chests. "That'd be the official cleanup crew," Jedediah said quietly, finally reaching for the whiskey May had poured. "Right on time, as usual." He tossed back the drink in one smooth motion, then added, "Might want to send someone to the telegraph office, Sheriff. Wire Fort Worth. Let them know we've got some prisoners that need transporting. Special detention. They'll understand what that means." The assembled townsfolk watched as the marshals entered, their presence somehow making the whole afternoon's events seem more real, more official. This wasn't just some random act of frontier justice anymore. This was part of something bigger, something that would be written about in newspapers as far away as St. Louis and Chicago. "Are you really passing through?" May asked suddenly, her voice carrying a note of hope. "Or might you be persuaded to stick around a spell? Town could use a man like you." Before Jedediah could respond, one of the marshals approached, his face serious beneath his rain-soaked hat. "Sir," he said formally, "we've got news from Austin you need to hear. It's about Representative Buchanan." The mention of Representative Buchanan brought a subtle change to Jedediah's weathered features. His eyes, which had begun to show the first signs of relaxation, hardened again like winter frost. The marshal's expression told him all he needed to know. Whatever news had come from Austin, it wasn't good. "Let's take this outside," Jedediah said quietly, but Denton's harsh laugh interrupted him. "Not so keen to share information now, are you?" The wounded outlaw sneered, some of his old bravado returning. "Oh, what's wrong, lawman? Afraid your perfect plan might have some holes in it?" Jedediah turned slowly, fixing Denton with a stare that made the outlaw's smirk waver. "Son, you're already headed for a hanging. Don't make me expedite the process." His voice carried the kind of authority that could only come from decades of backing up threats with action. The rain had stopped completely now, though water still dripped from the saloon's eaves like tears. Outside, the setting sun had found gaps in the breaking clouds, painting the wet streets of Broken Spoke in shades of gold and crimson. Jedediah followed the marshal onto the boardwalk, leaving Sheriff Hawkins and his deputies to secure the prisoners. "Buchanan's gone," the marshal said without preamble, his voice low enough that only Jedediah could hear. "Someone tipped him off before we could make the arrest. Cleared out his office in Austin, emptied his accounts at 3 different banks. We found his secretary." The marshal paused, his face grim. "Well, let's just say she won't be providing any more testimony." A muscle twitches in Jedediah's jaw, the first real sign of emotion he'd shown since walking into May Wilson's saloon. "How long?" "Best we can figure, he's had about 12 hours head start. Already have men watching the ports in Galveston and the border crossings into Mexico, but..." The marshal shrugged helplessly. "Man like that, with his connections and resources? He'll have help," Jedediah finished the thought. "Probably had a bolt hole prepared, just in case. Men like him always do." He gazed out at the rain-washed street, his mind already working through the implications. "What about the documents? The ones linking him to the railroad land grabs?" The second marshal joined them, his boots squeaking slightly on the wet boardwalk. "Gone, along with everything else that could have proven his involvement. Without the secretary's testimony..." He left the sentence hanging. Inside the saloon, they could hear Doc Sanders still working on the wounded men, his quiet instructions mixing with occasional grunts of pain. The townsfolk had begun to disperse, heading home to share the afternoon's excitement with their families, already transforming reality into legend. "There's more," the first marshal said, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "We found something in Morrison's papers, letters suggesting this goes higher than just a corrupt judge and a crooked representative. There's talk of a senator being involved, maybe even someone in the governor's office." Jedediah absorbed this information in silence, his face unreadable. Finally, he said, "Denton and his boys, do they know anything about this higher connection?" "Hard to say," the second marshal replied. "They were just hired guns, probably kept in the dark about most of it. But they might have heard things, seen things. Which is why they need to make it to Fort Worth alive," Jedediah finished. His hand unconsciously moved to the grip of his Colt. "And why someone might prefer they didn't." As if to emphasize his point, a horse whinnied nervously from the hitching post, picking up on the tension in the air. The setting sun cast long shadows down the street, perfect cover for anyone wanting to ensure that certain secrets stayed buried. May Wilson appeared in the saloon doorway, her face showing concern. "Everything all right out here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Just fine, ma'am," the first marshal replied automatically, but Jedediah raised his hand to stop him. "No, it's not," he said quietly. "And these folks have earned the right to know what they might be dealing with." He turned to face May directly. "Broken Spoke might need to brace itself for more trouble. The kind that comes wearing fancy suits and carrying papers instead of guns, but no less dangerous for all that." May's expression hardened with understanding. She'd seen too much of life to be shocked by the idea of corruption in high places. "Towns stood against you worse," she said firmly. "And now we know what to watch for." "Might not be that simple," Jedediah warned. "Men like Buchanan, they don't just steal money and land. They steal hope, dignity, the very thing that makes a town worth living in. And they do it all legal-like, with contracts and court orders instead of bullets." The sun dipped lower, setting the wet streets ablaze with reflected fire. In the distance, they could hear the sound of approaching horses, the deputies returning from Denton's camp, hopefully with the evidence they needed. But Jedediah's instincts, honed by decades of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer, told him this was far from over. "First priority is getting those prisoners to Fort Worth," he said, his voice taking on the tone of a man making plans. "But we'll need to be careful about it. No regular stage or prison wagon, that's too obvious. Need to make it look like we're just moving some drunks to the county jail. The marshals nodded, understanding the strategy. But May's next words brought them all up short. "Assuming they live that long," she said, nodding toward the darkening street. "Because unless my eyes are playing tricks, we've got company coming, and they don't look like they're here for the whiskey." The dying sunlight painted long shadows across Broken Spoke's main street as 6 riders approached from the south. They rode in a loose formation that spoke of military experience, their horses moving at an unhurried walk that somehow managed to convey more menace than a full gallop. The lead rider wore a black duster that seemed to swallow what remained of the day's light. Jedediah's hand hadn't moved to his gun yet, but his posture had changed subtly. The marshals noticed it, the way he shifted his weight onto the balls of his feet, how his arms hung loose at his sides, ready to draw at a moment's notice. It was the stance of a man who'd faced down death so many times they'd become old acquaintances. "May," he said quietly, "get back inside. Tell Sheriff Hawkins to move the prisoners to the back room, and make sure Doc Sanders has his kit ready. Something tells me he ain't done for the day." The saloon keeper nodded grimly and disappeared inside. Through the windows they could see movement as the townsfolk who remained inside began to sense the approaching danger. Sheriff Hawkins appeared in the doorway, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. "Friends of yours?" the first marshal asked, his hand resting near his own weapon. "Doubt it," Jedediah replied, studying the approaching riders. "Way they're riding, way they're spaced out. These are professionals. Probably hired guns, but not your usual barroom bruisers." He paused, then added, "Military trained, if I had to guess. Confederate cavalry, maybe." The second marshal squinted into the setting sun. "How can you tell?" "Formation they're using. It's called a scattered column. Cavalry used it when approaching a potentially hostile position. Keeps any single shot from taking out more than one rider." Jedediah's voice carried the weight of experience. "Saw it used at Shiloh, among other places." The riders drew closer, their features becoming clearer in the fading light. The man in the black duster had a face that seemed carved from granite, weathered by years and violence. A neat silver mustache adorned his upper lip, and a cavalry officer's sword hung at his side alongside a well-maintained Remington revolver. Behind him, his men were equally well-equipped, their weapons and tack speaking of quality and regular maintenance. These weren't the kind of hired guns who spent their pay on whiskey and women. These were professionals who invested in their tools. "Evening, gentlemen," the leader called out as they drew within speaking distance. His voice carried the cultured accent of old Virginia money, at odds with his rough appearance. "Quite a bit of excitement in town today from what we hear." "Town's closed to visitors," Sheriff Hawkins called back, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his stance. "Had enough excitement for one day?" The leader smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid we can't oblige you there, Sheriff. We've ridden a long way to have a word with certain parties." His gaze shifted to Jedediah. "You would be the one they call Swift Steel, I believe?" Former Texas Ranger, now working as a special investigator. Jedediah didn't respond immediately, taking time to study each of the riders in turn. Their guns were holstered, but their hands rested comfortably near them. Their horses, despite the long ride suggested by their dust-covered appearance, were still fresh enough for quick action if needed. "You seem to have me at a disadvantage," he finally said, his voice carrying across the now silent street. "You know my name, but I don't know yours." "Colonel James Blackwood, formerly of the 7th Virginia Cavalry," the leader replied with a slight bow. "These days I provide security consultation for various interested parties, one of whom is very concerned about recent events in this region." Inside the saloon they could hear the sounds of prisoners being moved, accompanied by muffled cursing from Denton. The sun had nearly set now, painting the clouds in shades of purple and crimson. In the growing darkness, lamplight began to spill from the saloon's windows, creating pools of yellow illumination on the wet street. "Security consultation," Jedediah repeated thoughtfully. That's a fancy way of saying hired gun, ain't it, Colonel? Though I suspect your rates are considerably higher than Mr. Denton and his associates commanded. Blackwood's smile widened slightly, showing teeth that gleamed in the fading light. Let's dispense with the verbal sparring, shall we? My employer is willing to be generous, far more generous than whatever the federal marshals are paying you. Name your price. Not for sale, Jedediah replied simply. Everyone has a price, Mr. McCullough, even men of principle. The colonel's voice hardened slightly. And if money won't motivate you, perhaps we should discuss certain events in your past. The real reason you left the Rangers, for instance. The two marshals tensed at this, but Jedediah's expression never changed. You've done your homework, Colonel, but if you'd done it thoroughly, you'd know threats won't work either. Then perhaps we should discuss the safety of this charming little town. Blackwood's gaze swept the street, taking in the watching faces in windows and doorways. It would be a shame if anything were to happen to it. Fires can start so easily in these dry conditions, despite today's rain. The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. Behind Jedediah, Sheriff Hawkins had been joined by several deputies, their hands hovering near their weapons. The evening stage was due soon, and any violence would put innocent passengers at risk. One last time, Blackwood said, his voice carrying the finality of an ultimatum. Step aside. Let us take the prisoners. Everyone lives, everyone profits, and this unfortunate business can be concluded without further bloodshed. The street had grown so quiet, they could hear the creak of leather as riders shifted in their saddles. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the tension-filled silence. A cool evening breeze stirred the dust in the street, carrying with it the lingering scent of rain and gunpowder from the earlier confrontation. Through the saloon windows, Mae Wilson watched the scene unfold, her hand once again resting on the ancient dragoon beneath her bar. She'd survived the war, survived 20 years of running a saloon in frontier towns, and she wasn't about to let some fancy-talking ex-Confederate colonel threaten her town. Around her, the remaining townsfolk had positioned themselves near windows and doors, makeshift weapons at hand. This was their home, and they'd fight for it if they had to. The evening stage could be heard in the distance, its approaching wheels adding another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Jedediah knew that whatever was going to happen needed to happen fast. Innocent passengers couldn't be caught in the crossfire of what was looking more and more like an inevitable confrontation. The evening air had grown thick with tension, heavy as a wool blanket in summer. Colonel Blackwood sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, his black duster rippling slightly in the cool breeze. Behind him, his men had subtly adjusted their positions, spreading out to cover more of the street while maintaining their disciplined formation. You're making a mistake, Colonel, Jedediah said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Whatever they're paying you, it ain't worth dying for. Those prisoners are going to Fort Worth, and the truth about this whole operation is coming out one way or another. Blackwood's silver mustache twitched in what might have been amusement. The truth? My dear Mr. McCullough, the truth is whatever the history books say it is. And history books are written by men with power and money, not by dead heroes. Inside the saloon, Doc Sanders had finished tending to the wounded prisoners and now stood near the back door, his medical bag packed but close at hand. He'd seen enough gunfights to know this confrontation wasn't going to end with just words. Sheriff Hawkins had positioned his deputies strategically, 2 guarding the prisoners, 3 covering the windows, and 2 more on the roof of the general store across the street. Maybe so, Jedediah conceded, his hands still loose at his sides. But I reckon even dead heroes serve a purpose. They remind folks that some things are worth dying for. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's despite the gathering dusk, noted every subtle movement of Blackwood's men. Question is, Colonel, what are you willing to die for? Money? Or something else? The colonel's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. You mistake me for a common mercenary, sir. I serve a greater purpose, the preservation of order, the maintenance of proper authority. These developments in Texas threaten to upset a very delicate balance. Proper authority? Jedediah's voice carried a hint of steel now. Like the authority that let rich men steal poor folks' land? That let corrupt judges and politicians line their pockets while honest people struggled? That kind of authority? The sound of the approaching stage grew louder, and Blackwood's men shifted uneasily in their saddles. They were professionals, and the idea of civilians getting caught in the crossfire clearly made them uncomfortable. The colonel himself showed no such concern, his cold eyes fixed on Jedediah. "I won't ask again," Blackwood said, his cultured accent taking on an edge of menace. "Step aside. Let us take the prisoners, or I promise you what happens next will be remembered in this territory for generations to come." May Wilson's voice suddenly rang out from the saloon doorway, clear and strong despite the tension. "You listen here, Colonel? This is our town. We've worked too hard, suffered too much to let men like you take it from us. You want those prisoners, you'll have to go through all of us." As if to emphasize her words, townspeople began emerging from doorways and alleys. Farmers with shotguns, storekeepers with old army rifles, ranch hands with six-shooters. They moved with purpose, taking up positions behind water troughs, wagon wheels, and stacked crates. These weren't trained soldiers, but they were people defending their home. The first marshal stepped forward, his badge catching the last light of day. "Colonel Blackwood, these men are in federal custody. Any attempt to interfere with their transport will be considered an act of insurrection against the United States government." "The government?" Blackwood's laugh was cold as the winter wind. "My dear Marshal, who do you think really runs the government? The same men who sent me here, who understand that progress requires sacrifices. Small towns like this are simply in the way of civilization's march forward." "Civilization?" Jedediah's voice dripped with contempt. "Is that what you call it when rich men in fancy offices steal and kill through papers and laws instead of guns? When they destroy communities and call it progress?" The stage was very close now, its thundering wheels and pounding hooves adding a dramatic backdrop to the confrontation. Blackwood's men had begun to spread out further, seeking better firing positions, but the townspeople matched their movements, refusing to give ground. "Last chance," Blackwood announced, his hand moving to rest on his cavalry sword. "Surrender the prisoners, or face the consequences." Jedediah's reply was cut off by a commotion from inside the saloon. Hank Denton, despite his wounds, had managed to overpower one of the deputies. He burst through the front door, using the young lawman as a shield, a stolen revolver pressed against the deputy's head. "Perfect timing, Colonel!" Denton shouted, his face flushed with pain and desperate triumph. "Now let's show these self-righteous bastards what happens when they mess with—" The report of Jedediah's Colt was deafening in the confined street. Denton's stolen gun went flying along with most of his trigger finger. The outlaw screamed and released his hostage, clutching his maimed hand to his chest. "That was mighty poor timing, son," Jedediah said quietly, his gun still smoking. "Now we got ourselves a real problem." The stage rounded the corner at that moment, its driver pulling the horses up short at the sight of armed men filling the street. The sun had finally set, leaving the scene illuminated only by lamplight spilling from windows and the rising moon's silver glow. Colonel Blackwood's face had turned to granite, his last chance for a peaceful resolution shattered by Denton's foolish attempt. "So be it," he said softly, drawing his sword with one hand and his revolver with the other. Take them all." The words had barely left his mouth when chaos erupted in the street. The stage driver, showing remarkable presence of mind, immediately whipped his team around in a tight turn, getting his passengers out of the line of fire. The moves sent up sparks from the wheels against the wet street, illuminating the scene in brief, hellish flashes. Sheriff Hawkins bellowed orders to his deputies, his voice cutting through the growing tension like a knife. "Get those passengers to safety, and somebody secure Denton before he causes any more trouble." In the fading light, Jedediah could see Blackwood's men shifting their horses, preparing for what was to come. They moved with the precision of seasoned cavalry, each man knowing his role in the coming violence. The townspeople, though less trained, stood their ground with the stubborn determination of those defending their home. "Your move, Colonel," Jedediah said quietly, his voice somehow carrying over the chaos. "But remember, whatever happens next, you started it. And I'll make sure that's what the history books say, assuming any of us are left to write them." The first shot came from somewhere above. One of Blackwood's men had spotted a deputy on the roof of the general store and decided to eliminate the threat. The bullet sparked off the tin roof, missing its target, but shattering the last fragments of peace in broken spoke. What followed was nothing like the quick, clean gunfights depicted in dime novels. The street erupted into chaos, with muzzle flashes lighting up the gathering darkness like lightning bugs in summer. Townspeople dove for cover as Blackwood's men unleashed a disciplined volley, their military training evident in their coordination. Jedediah moved like smoke in a windstorm, his twin Colts speaking with deadly precision. Two of Blackwood's men fell from their saddles before they could adjust their aim, their horses bolting in panic. The colonel himself had wheeled his mount behind a water trough, his sword gleaming in the lamplight as he shouted orders to his remaining men. "Get to the saloon." Mae Wilson's voice cut through the gunfire, directing townspeople to safety. She stood in the doorway, the ancient dragoon in her hands now, providing covering fire with surprising accuracy. "Doc Sanders, get ready. We're going to have more work for you." The two U.S. Marshals had taken positions on either side of the street, their experience showing in their measured shots and careful movement. They understood that this wasn't just about protecting prisoners anymore. This was about defending the very concept of law and order against those who would corrupt it. Inside the saloon, Billy Tucker had pressed himself into a corner, his wounded hand forgotten in the face of greater terrors. Luke Walker, despite his shoulder wound, had managed to drag himself behind an overturned table, watching the battle unfold through pain-clouded eyes. Jed Rollins lay unconscious, the shock of his lost fingers finally overtaking him. "Circle around," Blackwood commanded, his cultured accent giving way to the sharp tones of a cavalry officer. "Flank them through the alley. Johnson, take the high ground." But the townspeople had lived in Broken Spoke all their lives, and they knew every nook and cranny of their home. When Blackwood's men tried to move through the alley beside the blacksmith's shop, they found Jasper Grizzly Miller waiting with his shotgun. The old stablemaster's aim hadn't suffered with age. Two more of the colonel's men went down, clutching wounds that would keep them out of the fight. Sheriff Hawkins orchestrated the town's defense with the skill of a man who'd spent years preparing for just such a moment. His deputies had positioned themselves strategically, creating crossfire zones that made any movement by Blackwood's remaining men a dangerous proposition. "You're losing men, Colonel," Jedediah called out, his voice carrying over the sporadic gunfire. "Whatever they're paying you, it ain't worth watching the rest of your boys die." A bullet whined past his head in response, chipping stone from the wall behind him. Blackwood had traded his sword for a second revolver, and he was proving to be as deadly with firearms as his reputation suggested. "This is bigger than money, McCullough. Some things need to stay buried." The stage had managed to turn around completely and was now thundering back the way it had come, carrying its passengers to safety. But the sound of its departure was replaced by new hoofbeats approaching from the north, the deputies returning from Denton's camp. "Got what you asked for," one of them shouted, waving a leather satchel. "Found it right where you said it'd be." Blackwood's reaction to this news was immediate and violent. "Take them down," he roared, all pretense of refinement gone. "Get that satchel at all costs." The battle intensified, with bullets flying thick as summer mosquitoes, windows shattered, wood splintered, and the air filled with gun smoke and the shouts of men. Doc Sanders had set up a makeshift aid station in the back of the saloon, already treating the first casualties of the fight. Miss Betty Lou Parker proved herself more than just a shopkeeper, organizing a group of women to reload weapons and tend to the wounded. They moved with efficient purpose, proving that frontier life had prepared them for more than just social calls and church socials. Through it all, Jedediah moved like a ghost, his guns speaking only when necessary but never missing their mark. He'd seen enough battle to know that victory often went not to the side with the most men or the best weapons, but to those with the strongest will to prevail. "Your men are down or dying, Colonel," he called out during a lull in the firing. "You've lost your advantage. Surrender now, and we'll see you get a fair trial." The night had fully descended now, with muzzle flashes providing brief, stark illumination of the scene. The moon had risen, casting silver light that transformed the battlefield into something almost ethereal. In that light, they could see Colonel Blackwood rising from behind his cover, both guns held ready. Fair trial? The colonel's laugh was as harsh as breaking glass. "You still don't understand, do you? There won't be any trials. There won't be any justice. The people I work for, they don't allow loose ends." As if to emphasize his point, more hoofbeats could be heard approaching from the south. Reinforcements, answering Blackwood's earlier signal. The decisive moment of the battle was approaching, and everyone in Broken Spoke could feel it. Sheriff Hawkins's voice carried over the sound of approaching riders. "Whatever comes next, we stand together." The townspeople answered with a ragged cheer, their determination undiminished by the prospect of facing fresh enemies. May Wilson appeared at Jedediah's side, the dragoon steady in her hands. "Well, looks like you brought some excitement to my quiet little town after all." "Sorry about that," he replied, not taking his eyes off Blackwood. "But sometimes quiet ain't what a town needs. Sometimes you need to remember how to fight." The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, their rhythm matching the pounding hearts of everyone in the street. The townsfolk checked their ammunition, sharing what they had left among themselves like a family sharing their last meal. They had come together in a way that only shared danger could inspire, proving that the spirit of the frontier was alive and well in Broken Spoke. "Whatever happens next," Jedediah said softly, though his voice carried to those nearby, "remember that you all chose to stand when you could have run. That's something they can't take from you, no matter how this ends." Blackwood's silhouette against the rising moon seemed to grow more ominous as he prepared for what would surely be the final act of this deadly drama. His remaining men gathered around him, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight, ready for one last attempt to complete their mission. The thunder of approaching hooves grew louder, echoing off the buildings of Broken Spoke like rolling drums before a battle. Colonel Blackwood's thin smile grew wider with each passing second, his confidence bolstered by the promise of reinforcements. But something in Jedediah's steady stance made him pause. The former ranger showed no sign of concern at the approaching riders. "You hear that, McCullough?" Blackwood called out, his cultured accent tinged with triumph. "That's the sound of your noble last stand coming to an inglorious end. My men will sweep this street clean, and by morning Broken Spoke will be nothing but ashes and memories." May Wilson's grip tightened on her ancient dragoon. "We've weathered worse than you, Colonel. Indians, bandits, drought, and disaster, this town doesn't break easy." The hoofbeats were nearly upon them now, accompanied by the jingle of cavalry equipment. Blackwood raised his hand, preparing to signal his remaining men for one final assault before their reinforcements arrived. The moonlight caught the silver buttons on his black duster, making them shine like stars. But when the riders finally appeared at the end of the street, they weren't what anyone expected. Leading the column was a familiar figure in a dust-covered Union Army uniform, Captain Marcus Reynolds of the Texas Rangers, a man Jedediah had telegraphed 3 days ago when he first caught wind of Denton's connection to bigger things. "Evening, folks," Reynolds called out, his voice carrying the authority of both law and military command. "Hope we're not too late to join the party." Behind him, 24 Rangers and U.S. Marshals spread out across the street, their rifles gleaming in the moonlight. The change in Blackwood's expression was almost worth the price of admission. His confident smile crumbled like a sandcastle in a storm, replaced by the cold calculation of a man reassessing his odds. His remaining men shifted uneasily in their saddles, looking to their leader for direction. "Appears the reinforcements weren't for you after all, Colonel," Jedediah said quietly, but his voice carried in the sudden silence. "Captain Reynolds has been mighty interested in this case, especially after we found those documents in Judge Morrison's safe, the ones with your signature on them." Sheriff Hawkins and his deputies had begun moving forward, using the distraction to secure better positions. The townspeople followed their lead, tightening the noose around Blackwood and his remaining men. Even Doc Sanders had emerged from the saloon, though he kept to the shadows, ready to tend any new casualties. "It's over, Colonel," Captain Reynolds announced, dismounting with practiced ease. "We've got Morrison in custody, Buchanan's bank accounts frozen, and enough evidence to hang everyone involved in this land-grabbing scheme. Only question is whether you want to add resisting arrest and murder to the charges." Blackwood's response was as sudden as it was violent. His revolver seemed to materialize in his hand as he spurred his horse forward, firing at Jedediah with deadly accuracy. But the former ranger hadn't survived countless gunfights by being slow. He dove and rolled, coming up with both Colts blazing. The street erupted once again into chaos. Blackwood's remaining men, seeing their leader commit to one final desperate gambit, opened fire on both the townspeople and the newly arrived lawmen. The night air filled with gun smoke, and the sharp crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of shotguns. "Take them alive if you can," Reynolds shouted above the din. "We need their testimony." Jedediah and Blackwood had ended up behind opposite sides of an overturned wagon, their gun battle becoming a personal duel within the larger firefight. The colonel's military training showed in every move, but Jedediah's experience in close-quarter combat proved equally deadly. "You don't understand what you're destroying," Blackwood called out between shots. "The railroad's coming, progress is coming. Small towns like this, they're just kindling for the fire of civilization." "Civilization?" Jedediah's reply was punctuated by careful shots that kept the colonel pinned down. "Civilization ain't about destroying the small to benefit the mighty. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves." Around them, the battle was turning decisively in favor of the law. The rangers and marshals, working in concert with the townspeople, had already captured or wounded most of Blackwood's remaining men. But the colonel himself fought on with the desperate energy of a man who knew the gallows awaited him if he surrendered. A stray bullet had knocked over one of the street lamps, and the spilled oil had caught fire, casting wild shadows across the battlefield. In this hellish illumination, Miss Betty Lou Parker led a group of townswomen in dragging wounded men to safety, their courage matching any shown by the armed combatants. "Your type is finished, McCullough," Blackwood shouted, his voice taking on an edge of madness. "The world's changing. Men like you, towns like this, you're all just ghosts that don't know you're dead yet." May Wilson, who had worked her way around behind the colonel's position, called out in response, "Maybe so, Colonel. But ghosts can still haunt the living." Her ancient dragoon roared, the heavy ball taking Blackwood's hat clean off his head and convincing him to keep down. The fire from the broken lamp had begun to spread, turning the street into a maze of light and shadow. Through the smoke and chaos, Jedediah could see Captain Reynolds organizing his men for a final push. The net was closing and Blackwood was running out of both ammunition and options. "Last chance, Colonel," Jedediah called out, his voice steady despite the mayhem surrounding them. "Surrender now. Testify against your employers, and maybe you'll see daylight again before they put you in the ground. Fight on, and I guarantee you won't see another sunrise." Colonel Blackwood's answer came in the form of gunfire, his remaining bullets sparking off the wagon behind which Jedediah had taken cover. The spreading fire from the broken lamp had turned the street into an inferno of shadow and flame, transforming Broken Spoke's main street into something resembling a scene from Dante's vision of hell. "You want me?" Blackwood shouted, his cultured accent completely gone now, replaced by the raw voice of a man with nothing left to lose. "Come and get me." With that, he broke from his cover, firing as he ran not toward escape, but toward the saloon where the original prisoners were still held. Jedediah recognized the colonel's intent immediately. If he could reach Denton and the others, he could either silence them permanently or use them as hostages. Either way, it would mean more bloodshed, more death in a night already too full of both. "He's heading for the prisoners." Jedediah's warning carried over the chaos, spurring both lawmen and townspeople into action. But the burning oil had created a barrier of flame across part of the street, limiting their ability to intercept the colonel. May Wilson, still positioned near the saloon's side entrance, understood the danger immediately. She rushed inside, her ancient dragoon at the ready, preparing to defend her establishment one last time. Through the windows, they could see her organizing the few people inside to form a last line of defense. Captain Reynolds and his rangers tried to maneuver for clear shots, but Blackwood's mad dash had been well planned. He used the smoke and confusion to his advantage, making it impossible to fire without risking innocent lives. The few bullets that did find their way toward him seemed to pass through his duster without effect, as if the night itself was protecting him. "Like I said," Blackwood called out as he reached the saloon's porch, "history is written by the victors." He punctuated this declaration by firing his remaining shots through the saloon's windows, sending everyone inside diving for cover. But Jedediah had seen enough death in his life to recognize the desperation in Blackwood's voice. This wasn't the calculated violence of a professional soldier anymore. This was the last stand of a man who'd seen his world crumbling and chosen to go down in flames rather than face the consequences of his actions. "Actually," Jedediah replied, stepping out into the firelit street, "history is written by the survivors." His voice carried a certainty that made everyone, even Blackwood, pause. "And after tonight, there'll be plenty of survivors to tell this story." The colonel turned, his gun tracking toward Jedediah's voice, only to find himself facing not just the former ranger, but what seemed like the entire town of Broken Spoke. Townspeople had emerged from their positions, forming a semicircle around the saloon. Rangers and marshals filled in the gaps, their weapons trained on the last remnant of corruption that had plagued their community. "It's finished, Colonel," Captain Reynolds called out, his voice carrying the weight of official justice. "Your men are captured or dead. Morrison's singing like a canary in Fort Worth. Even now, federal agents are seizing documents from Representative Buchanan's associates. The whole house of cards is falling." Inside the saloon, they could hear Doc Sanders speaking quietly but firmly to the wounded prisoners. "Don't even think about it, Mr. Denton. You've lost enough blood tonight without adding to it." Blackwood stood on the porch, his black duster rippling in the heat from the nearby fires. The silver buttons caught the light, making him look almost ghostly in the hellish illumination. His guns were empty. Everyone could tell by the way he held them, but somehow that made him seem more dangerous, not less. "You think this ends with me?" He laughed, the sound harsh as breaking glass. "There will be others. There will always be others. Progress cannot be stopped by one town's futile resistance." "Maybe not," Jedediah acknowledged, taking another step forward. "But tonight ain't about stopping progress. It's about teaching men like you that there are some things that can't be bought, some people who won't be bullied, and some lines that shouldn't be crossed." May Wilson's voice rang out from inside the saloon, steady as a rock. "We're all still here, Colonel. Every person you threatened, every life you endangered. We're here, we're standing, and we're not afraid anymore." The fire had begun to die down. The spilled oil nearly burned away. In its fading light, they could see something change in Blackwood's expression. A realization, perhaps, that some battles couldn't be won with guns or money or political influence. "Your choice, Colonel," Jedediah said quietly. "Die here, alone, or live to face justice. Either way, this story gets told. Either way, people will know that one small town stood up against men who thought their money made them gods." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the dying fires and the soft moans of the wounded being tended to by Doc Sanders and his impromptu nurses. The moon had risen higher, casting its silver light over the scene, as if nature herself wanted to illuminate this moment of truth. Blackwood looked at his empty guns, then at the faces surrounding him. Not just lawmen, but shopkeepers, farmers, women, and children, all united in their determination to defend their home. In their eyes, he saw something he'd forgotten existed, the unshakable courage of ordinary people pushed too far. His weapons hit the porch boards with a hollow thud. "You're right about one thing, McCullough. he said as Captain Reynolds moved to take him into custody. "This story will be told, but I don't think it's going to have the ending you expect." The first rays of morning sun crept over the horizon, painting Broken Spoke's battered Main Street in shades of gold and promise. The night's fires had burned themselves out, leaving behind scorched timber and blackened earth as testament to the battle that had raged just hours before. Doc Sanders was still tending to the wounded in his clinic, his steady hands having worked through the night to save both friend and foe alike. Colonel Blackwood and his surviving men had been secured in the town jail, along with Denton's gang. Captain Reynolds had stationed his most trusted rangers as guards, though it seemed unlikely any of the prisoners had fight left in them. The colonel sat in his cell in silence, his black duster hanging like a shadow on the wall, its silver buttons dulled by gunsmoke and defeat. Jedediah stood on May Wilson's porch, watching as townspeople began the work of rebuilding. Already, shopkeepers were sweeping up broken glass, ranchers were helping repair damaged storefronts, and women were organizing relief efforts for those whose homes had been damaged in the fighting. "Quite a mess," May said, joining him with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one, the morning light catching the silver in her hair. "But I reckon it was worth it." "Always is," Jedediah replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Town like this, with people like this, it's worth fighting for. Worth dying for, if need be." He took a sip, appreciating the rich flavor. May never served the cheap stuff, even after a night like they'd had. Sheriff Hawkins approached, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Despite the bandage on his arm where a bullet had grazed him, he carried himself with renewed purpose. "Just got word from Fort Worth," he announced. "Federal marshals found Buchanan trying to board a ship in Galveston. They've got him in custody, along with 3 bank presidents and a railroad executive." "The whole nest of snakes," May commented, satisfaction evident in her voice. "Most of them, anyway," Jedediah corrected. "Men like that, they're like cockroaches. For every one you see, there's 10 hiding in the walls." He paused, watching as Miss Betty Lou Parker organized a group of women to provide breakfast for those who'd fought to defend the town. "But maybe next time they'll think twice about which towns they try to push around." Captain Reynolds joined them, his uniform still dusty from the night's action. "The prisoners will be transported to Fort Worth this afternoon. We've got enough evidence now to put most of them away for life." He turned to Jedediah with a slight smile. "The Rangers could use a man like you back in the service. The offer is still open." Jedediah shook his head, his eyes on the rising sun. "Appreciate it, Captain. But those days are behind me. Sometimes a man needs to know when to hang up his badge and let younger folks take up the fight." "And what about you?" May asked, something unspoken in her question. "Will you be moving on, now that the excitement is over?" Before he could answer, Jasper Grizzly Miller's voice rang out from down the street. "Found something interesting in Denton's saddlebags." The old stablemaster was waving a packet of papers. "Looks like maps of every stage route and railroad survey from here to the territory." "Better add those to the evidence," Captain Reynolds called back. But Jedediah's attention had shifted to something else. A group of children had emerged from their homes, playing in the street, as if nothing had happened. Their laughter carried on the morning breeze, a reminder of what they'd really been fighting for. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been wandering a long time, seeing a lot of towns fighting a lot of battles that needed fighting." He turned to May, seeing the hope in her eyes. "Maybe it's time to find out what it's like to fight for just one place, to put down some roots." Sheriff Hawkins cleared his throat. "Town could use a deputy who knows his business. Pay ain't much, but it comes with a house on Cedar Street. Previous owner won't be needing it, seeing as he turned out to be working with Blackwood's bunch." The sun had fully risen now, its light touching every corner of Broken Spoke, chasing away the last shadows of the night's violence. Down the street, Doc Sanders emerged from his clinic, tired but satisfied that all his patients would live. Billy Tucker, his hand bandaged but his young face showing the first signs of wisdom earned the hard way, was helping an old woman repair her broken window. Might be that every town needs someone who remembers, Jedediah said thoughtfully. Someone who knows the difference between real progress and the kind that comes at the end of a gun. He turned to May, a smile touching his weathered features. And your coffee is better than most. May's answering smile was like the dawn itself. Well then, guess I better keep a pot warm. Never know when some fool's going to try starting trouble in a quiet town. The morning stage arrived right on schedule, bringing mail, passengers, and news from the outside world. But the passengers who stepped down found something unusual. A town standing tall, its people united, its spirit unbroken. They found a place where ordinary folks had stood their ground against forces that would have destroyed them, and in standing, had become extraordinary. Welcome to Broken Spoke, Jedediah heard May telling a newly arrived family, pride evident in her voice. Don't let the bullet holes fool you, this here's a peaceful town. We just remind folks of that fact from time to time. And so the sun rose fully on a new day in Broken Spoke, Texas. The town had changed, as all things must, but it had changed on its own terms. The quiet cowboy who had walked into a saloon the previous afternoon had found something he didn't know he was looking for: a home worth defending, a cause worth serving, and people worth standing beside. The wind carried away the last traces of gunsmoke and with it, the last echoes of the night's violence. But the story would be told, passed down through generations, of how one quiet man with fast guns and a steady heart had helped a town find its courage, and in doing so had found his own place in the world. Some said later that you could still see bullet holes in the saloon's walls years afterward. May Wilson never patched them all, saying they were good for business, and for reminding folks that some things were worth fighting for, and some places were worth calling home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.